So let's jump into hearing from our panelists. So just a bit of an intro of each of you, like talk about your background, what you've worked on, what you're working on, how you ended up in conversation design. It's always an interesting topic. I'd love to start with Alyssa, if that's all right, and just kick it off.
Hello, so my name is Alyssa, and I live in Winnipeg, Canada, which is not a hotbed of tech, but the cool thing about conversation design is you can live somewhere like Winnipeg, Canada, and still work in tech. So I have both a bachelor's and a master's in linguistics. My bachelor's was incredibly broad. I did every subfield. And then for my master's, I specialized in internet sociolinguistics. So as an internet sociolinguist, we look at questions like, how do hashtags work across different websites? What are the different functions that hashtags have? What's up with boomers? Why do they love ellipses and do weird things on the internet? And also, like, what about Gen Z? Are they actually doing different things, or are they just appropriating African-American vernacular, English, drag culture, gay culture? So internet sociolinguist is really fun because it's so broad, and basically any writing on the internet anywhere is fair game. And then how I got into conversation design specifically is I was working in a marketing capacity because I was really interested in language in social media. So marketing lent itself to that. And Master of Code, where I work currently, actually reached out to me specifically because I had a linguistics degree and said, essentially, you have a skill set that's really valuable, and we'll teach you conversation design. So a year and a half later, I've worked in all sorts of industries and across all stages of the bot lifecycle. So starting from the very beginning of a bot to optimizing an already existing bot.
Mary, would you like to jump in next?
Mary, it seems like we're not hearing your audio, perhaps.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that sounds
okay.
Good.
Okay, so I'm Mary. I'm Italian. I live in Spain. I have a passion for languages. I speak 5 languages. I have a BA in translation, so I have a strong background in translation and interpreting. And funny enough, I got into linguistics after I started to work as a conversation designer. So I worked for many years as a translator, content creator. And in 2019, I discovered the Conversation Design Institute. I got certified in conversation design, and I started to work as a freelance conversation designer. And that is where I understood that there was a whole part of a conversational AI project that I wanted to know more. And to do that, I had to study linguistics. So it's not that I study linguistics as a consequence of me studying already, of being already into languages, but I think knowing what is a conversational AI project about got me curious and willing to know more. So I studied linguistics and cognitive studies. Right now, I work as a conversation designer for a consulting firm in Madrid, and I do just pure conversation designer. So I work in a team with linguists, and I just work as a conversation designer. Maybe it would be interesting then to discuss what are the differences, because often conversation designers do linguistic work, but many times it doesn't happen. So right now I'm just working as a conversation designer.
So then I'll pop in and introduce myself last. Save the best for last. Hello, everyone. My name is Faylene. I come humbly to the field of conversational AI from linguistics. I got my bachelor's from the First Nations University of Canada. My master's was at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And then I did 2 years of a PhD before leaving academia and moving to Israel, where I applied for a conversation designer job, and I was told that I don't speak like an American, so they couldn't give me the job. But my linguistics was good enough to give me a job in QA. And then for the last 4.5 years, woo, yes, for the last 4 years, I have moved in just about every area that I could within a startup company. I did content design, conversation design, intent management. I've worked as QA, as a developer. I've worked assisting marketing teams, all with a background in linguistics, and that's where it really came in to play. Right now, I think I would call myself a voice user interface designer. I prefer working with voice than I do with chat, which we can go into, and I think is very exciting to go into, but I don't want to delay this any longer. If you have any interest in knowing more about me, I'll put a link in the chat to my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect. And then I won't stall us any longer. Please, Hope, take it away.
Thank you. So perfect. I can connect this directly to kind of the first topic for the panel, which is really how do you all leverage your linguistics backgrounds for conversation design? And I'm sure folks heard, it's very interesting. When we talk about conversation design, everyone comes from very different backgrounds. And even with linguistics, we've heard very different points. So I'll kick it to Alyssa first, but yeah, how are we, in your space, leveraging your linguistics background for conversation design, and maybe a little bit like how you're using that to guide others, be they trainers, designers, marketers, all those friends.
So I think the really cool thing about being a linguist in conversation design is if you get 10 conversation designers in a room that all have linguistics backgrounds, they all probably come from a different subfield. So they all bring different perspectives to the table. So if we're all going to write the same prompt, someone might be more focused on the pragmatic side, someone might be more focused on the morphology side, and I think that's really cool that there's a lot of space for linguists in conversation design because linguistics is so broad. And then for me, what I find is I do a lot of actual internal education. So I spend a lot of time sort of explaining linguistics in bite-sized fun facts to my coworkers, to clients, and getting them to think about language in a way that they haven't thought before, getting them to challenge assumptions that they don't even realize are assumptions. And I think what's really cool about that is there's like a tangible impact in that if I tell someone a language-related fun fact, they're going to pass that fun fact on. So as much as I have a highly theoretical background, when I'm talking to people at work, the theory never comes up, right? So it's a skill about how to communicate really complex linguistic topics in a way that is accessible and repeatable, so your impact kind of waterfalls through. So I think that's really how I use my linguistics background, is sort of educating people when they don't realize they're being educated. So you kind of have to do it in sneaky ways, but I think I make it fun. And I have coworkers in the chat if they want to agree with that or not.
Well, I'll throw in there from my side. One of the things that I find fabulous about linguistics, I don't know how everyone else took theirs, mine was very much a science. We did statistics, all of that came into play. And being able to do that and look at conversations and point out things like this is important and this is notable was really very useful. Even when it came to things like QA, quality assurance, where I would be able to say, listen, this doesn't sound right, and I can tell you why it doesn't sound right if you write it this way. This is incredibly valuable to a team that is working on a product for a language which is not the native language of the team. And we were able to leverage that exceptionally well, and we were able to make use of dialogue flow in a way that was more semantically based while I was managing it. So it's an interesting thing to be able to say, hey, I have this perspective. That also being said, we're able to play around with the SSML, so your text to speech, how it sounds, because I'm able to easily fix it because of phonology. I understand it, I understand phonetics, and I can change stuff. So that's where I leverage mine.
Well, for me, as I said, it's a fun part of a of a conversational AI project. It's the part where actually we are teaching machines to talk like humans. And one of the things that I enjoyed, where I thought my linguistic background was most useful, is working with Italian, because it's very gendered language. So when designing for an inclusive language, there's always we always have to find other ways to reformulate sentences, utterances. So I think without having a linguistic background, it would be difficult, because I see that some of my colleagues just don't think that there could be other ways to address a user without being without explicitly saying you as a male, for instance, which is the what is used normally in Italian. So I think in that way, in inclusiveness, linguistics is also very important.
I love that point, and it connects to some of the other questions, Mary, that we've had. So I'll maybe keep this to you, and then the others can chime in. But when we talk about kind of creating conversations for multiple languages, or maybe even languages that most of the team is not familiar with, are there best practices that you leverage for that? Are there guidelines that can extend across those different languages? How do you approach and kind of help make sure, when we're talking about multilingual conversational experiences, that they're created so they work best for the folks that are engaging with them?
Yeah, well, the ideal would be to have a multilingual team. If that is not possible, I think it's crucial to involve native conversation designers or native linguists or copywriters, because there's no other way of creating something that, and it's not just about the language. I think when designing for another language, we should actually think that we are designing for another country, because for instance, Spanish is a very peculiar language. There's no country that speaks Spanish that speaks the same Spanish. So it's something very very simple, like a female name in Spain could be a terrible word in Argentina. And there's no way, we cannot possibly know all the languages. I wish I could, but that is not possible. So I think there is the need for a lot of research before designing. And ideally, if you cannot have a multilingual team, at least you should hire maybe an agency that does specifically localization or transcreation, because that is what it's about. It's about creating something in another language, but for another country. And one of the mistakes that I often see is, okay, we will build this chatbot first in English, and then we will translate it. There's always a lot of information, a lot that is lost in translation, not just in terms of words, but also the personality can be lost in translation. So my advice would be involve people, have a multilingual team, or involve people from the countries where you want to deploy your chatbot.
I'm a pipe in to agree with that. One of the things that we discussed before the panel started was that I personally, we've experienced working with teams that are multilingual. And even if you have the best speakers or somebody who is amazing at the language that you're working in, if they're not native to the culture, they may use idioms that don't work, or are old, or are fully made up, which are brilliant in speech, but can sort of break secondary belief when applied to a IVR or a chatbot or a voice bot. So my 2 cents, but I think Mary covered it pretty nice, eh?
And you did mention voice, so I am going to go there since you offered to talk about it before. So this might be, we've heard this, maybe we can do like a face-off. Not really, but so we've heard Alyssa kind of talk about chat and kind of a focus in that area. And we've heard Faylene talk about voice. I'd love to hear more from both of you of how that approach is different and maybe why you came to those preferences. And it doesn't necessarily have to leverage your linguistic background, although I do feel like that plays a part.
I would love to jump in here because yes, I do consider this to be a very interesting topic, and I think that not a lot of people consider it to be. And so I think as linguists, we'll come into it and we'll notice differences. So I mentioned that I prefer voice. I prefer voice because one, I come from a background of language documentation. I'm much more of a descriptivist than a prescriptivist, which can lead to fun, meaning that you can use the language in a lot more diverse or interesting ways. Grammar is less important in speech. It's important, but like look at English. The grammar of English was written by someone who was writing a grammar for Latin and then applied it to English. Great, wonderful. Not exceptionally useful when you're dealing with human speech production and how it's naturally generated. So when it comes to the approach of how to write speech, one of the difficulties is that sometimes you'll see people who aren't used to knowing the difference and noticing the difference, writing out copy that is very, very, how do you say it? Very, very grammatically correct. They've made sure all of the punctuation is there. They've made sure it looks beautiful and it's written well. But if you get a voice bot to say it, they're going to pause at all of the commas. And you don't want them to pause the commas because then it sounds weird. And a lot of times when it comes to voice, you need to test everything multiple times and run multiple people. So I do like voice a little bit more because I think it has a lot more freedom, but also it's less forgiving if you make mistakes. So there's a lot more, I feel, pressure. But Alyssa, tell me what you think because we disagree.
I think it's interesting because I approach chat from actually a very similar perspective in that I am also a descriptivist and not a prescriptivist. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is meeting language users where they're at and letting people know that a lot of the grammar rules that you're taught in English class, they have racist history, they have misogynistic history, like just because you learn something in school, it doesn't mean that's how language users actually think, and that's not how brains work. And I think there's actually been a big push into making chat conversational by sort of understanding that, yeah, we don't want to think about Oxford commas or serial commas. What we want to be interested in is how do we actually reflect the way users speak, particularly because a lot of users have a lot lower reading level than one might expect. And a lot of users are communicating in languages that aren't their first. So you have to be respectful of that too. So I would like to think that any project that I touch, that Master of Code touches, we're not doing stuffy formal grammar. We're doing it in a way that people can write in all sorts of different ways and the bot will still understand it.
Yeah, because if I may add something, because what you said, Faylene, is right. Most of the chatbots, text chatbots, are written as if it was a text, like a blog post, or sometimes Q&A are just, chatbots are just Q&A brought into a chatbot. But we should, when we chat, like when we chat with our friends, we don't write as we were, if we were writing a blog post, we write as if we were talking. So that's a real challenge to write text for chatbots that sound natural.
that also at the same time work for the companies behind them, because if you wanted it to sound natural, there's a difference between natural sounding and natural writing.
Yeah.
And I think that it's an interesting perspective to come at it from. And I think that there's also the visuality. I love language. It's great. All of you didn't love that fail. But how it looks, the visual impact of a chatbot. For instance, if I saw a chatbot that didn't have an Oxford comma, I'd be like, what? Why are they giving me 3 parallelisms, but there's no Oxford comma? Because it is a visual as well. Whereas voice, we can play around with it. You can make the image through prosody. Prosody doesn't exist inside of chat. So I think that's, I like the creativeness that you can pull out of that, and what you can make of it, and how people can assign full personalities to just 2 lines of speech. And then also the complexities of how do you deal with the sociolinguistic impacts of making the voice feminine. There's been lots of studies that female voices typically end sentences with questions, like the prosody raises. Look to the Jeopardy studies, those are very fun. Do you make a chatbot, a voice bot that does that? One of the things I've noticed in my own work is that I actually remove most of the question marks, because the systems behind the text to speech will, every time there's a question, raise prosody as if it were a question. And oftentimes we don't want that. And so therein lies sort of the fun creativeness that you can get away without destroying, well, the visualness. And if you look at anything that I've written as if it were a chatbot, you'd be like, wow, she has no idea how language works. But then you're linguist, so then you would, yes, maybe.
I think there's also the component of for voice, right? Like, you know, I prefer having a chatbot because then I can have it silent and I'm doing it while I'm doing something else. Or for example, my mom is hard of hearing, so she can't use voice bots at all. So while prosody is super cool, vocal fry is really important in establishing that it's not just young women, men do it too. I think that, like, while voice is really like flashy and interesting, it doesn't work for everybody, and chat doesn't work for everybody either. Like there's the inverse as well. But I think that's why, again, being linguists, it's really nice that I can be focused on chat and you can be focused on voice, because that way we cover both user segments, or ideally doing something multimodal.
It is interesting that they have the capability of doing both. One of the things I find fascinating is companies that try to do both in the same system. So there's certain skills on Alexa that actually write out what is being said, and they're usually exact copies of each other. And so then when you do that, you start saying, well, one of them sounds or looks wrong. So from that, you can very easily sort of see that there's a difference. So yeah, and I think that you're right. They both have their own different perspectives and when they're supposed to be used, and companies will come up with their products for why they want voice or why they want chat. Use cases. Maybe that's for us to decide, but for the most part, I do think that it comes down to what you seek, what you go for as a linguist, or as anyone looking for a job. What do you prefer to work with? Voice, chat, IVR, microcopy in general. Microcopy is a good role for linguists, just as a heads up. It's really cool. I haven't done it, but it's really cool.
So that's kind of another perfect connection to an additional question that we've gotten from folks. You know, linguistics isn't necessarily a simple field. You all have talked about, there's actually a lot of different types when we talk about linguistics of what you can go into, but if someone's interested in learning more, or perhaps even being a practitioner or formal studier of linguistics, what are your all's recommendations? Like, where should they start? What should they look into? It doesn't always have to be resources. It could be, you know, this is how you should maybe approach even your thinking in this space.
So I think I come at linguistics as, if you're already a linguist, it's a science like physics. It's observation of the world around you, of features that people use, and then the categorization therein of it semantically, pragmatically, sociolinguistically, dialectically, morphosyntactically, even phonetically, all of those things. It's a science. And so if you want to leverage it as you're already a linguist, then it's additive. Take a course like the CDI one that we've given you a coupon for, or go through other courses that will definitely teach you how to be a conversation designer and write copy for that. Because I think that you as a linguist already have the skills to enter this field fully and completely. You just need to apply. Yeah, but for anyone who wants to add linguistics to them, Mary is a good example, and she can directly talk to this. I think that you need to know what you're looking for and what you want to do. If you're going into chat, it may be useless for you to look at phonetics and phonology. Don't look at prosody. Don't look at even morphosyntax. You don't necessarily need that unless you're working with a language that directly touches that. But pragmatics and sociolinguistics are going to be your best friend. And I can share in the chat, should be on that side, some resources for that other people have created. But I think that the trick is, if you already have the skills as a linguist, apply to a job. Know that you're a linguist, know that you can do project management. If you've done a master's degree, you have project management. You've worked on a team, a group to produce research, project management. If you've done any type of statistical analysis, QA, you're good. If you've ever done any documentation, QA, you're good. As linguists, you're already ready to go. But do take courses if you want to go directly into conversation design that can let you know the lingo and how it works. That's my 2 cents, but Mary, you can jump in because you came from the opposite side as I did.
Yeah, well, I mean, if somebody doesn't want to go into an university career, then what I might suggest is to watch YouTube videos, because there are a lot. There are channels, I can't remember now, I'm sorry, but you just Google them. There are channels on linguistics that are pretty well organized in syntax, semantics, phonetics, and phonology. So, because as Falin said, linguistics is a science, so you cannot. There's nothing such a little bit of linguistics. You really have to decide what is that you're more interested in. Maybe it's phonetics and phonology if you want to work with voice. Maybe it's syntax or semantics. There's an interesting book that it's really like basic. I really like it. It's on language acquisition. It's called The Language Instinct. I think it's interesting for somebody who doesn't know anything about linguistics to understand how language acquisition works, and it might give an idea. Okay, maybe I want to know more about phonetics. Maybe I want to know more about syntax. Yeah, that's all. I don't think there's anything to add.
And I have some resources for the opposite. So if you're a conversation designer and you're interested in linguistics, so one of them is, there's a ton of really great linguistics podcasts that are for lay people. But the number one that I have to recommend is called Linguistics, and I will drop the link in the chat here, and it's available on all streaming platforms. And what's also really great about it is every episode has a transcript. So if you're like me and you're not a podcast person, you can still get the content that way. And then the other little YouTube that I would recommend, if you're kind of like, do I want to learn more about linguistics? I don't understand what the different fields are. The creators of the Linguistics podcast, because they're really at the forefront of pop linguistics outreach. They partnered with Hank and John Green that do a YouTube channel called Crash Course, where there's crash course into history, biology, any subject that you can think of. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat here now. And there are 10 little bite-sized episodes that introduce you to all of the major fields, which will be useful if you're like, well, I don't know if I like voice, or I don't know if I like chat, because there's just enough information to kind of pique your interest to be like, oh, I'm actually super interested in prosody, or no, I want to do like what Alyssa does and study boomers.
I'm going to jump in and just take a little bit of an issue. Boomers with ellipses. I love ellipses. Does that make me a boomer? Oh, that hurts just a little bit.
No, it's the way that you use ellipsis and a boomer uses ellipsis, and I should air quotes in here, is completely different. But it is sort of a very accessible stereotype that most people can relate to sort of within our age bracket. They go, oh yes, I know someone who communicates in that way. So I'm using that as a shorthand, but no, ellipsis is used all the time by all sorts of generations and in different ways. So ellipsis is good. It's just that the way that boomers apply it is they're using holdovers from physical writing. So writing postcards, and it doesn't translate the tone correctly. They think they're doing one thing and we think they're doing something else.
Totally fair.
Like LOL.
Or random capitalization. I definitely have seen it. It's used very differently between generations, or sometimes it's interpreted as offensive to randomly capitalized words. So we do have a couple questions in chat, and I know Bailey, you kind of touched on both of them too, but for the rest of the group, we have interested to know your thoughts of the design process for use cases that combine voice and chat. So, you know, potentially what to do about that, how to maybe approach that in a way where we're not conflating them both as the same thing, or how to balance both of them.
So I spoke a bit of this in chat, but I'll reiterate for anyone who didn't read it. Because I think that written speech and spoken speech have different purposes for different audiences. If you're going to combine them both, see what the purpose is, because written speech doesn't have the same inflection, so you may have to add it with brackets and things that aren't fully expressed. For instance, any type of sarcasm you may want to change or note. But also how fast do you want to go through it? People have a certain reading speed. Is that going to affect the general understanding? Do you need to change the speech to match it? Should they match one for one? As somebody who loves Korean dramas, I don't think that subtitles actually ever 100% match what's actually being said. And even some of my favorite subtitles are the ones that are just like, here's an extra bit of information that you might not know. So I think that when you're designing something that includes both, thank you, Danny, either go ahead and make it so that they match the writing, because that's going to be much more visually appealing. And you don't want to have someone just go, and how do you say that or express it? Or just recognize that they have different audiences and make it so that they're similar, not enough of a difference that would cause people to have cognitive dissonance when they're trying to understand both, but different enough that they get some benefit from having both. My thought.
I think a good tip for people who are like, well, I don't understand why they're not the same, is to write something out and then like flip it over so you can't see it, and then try and say the exact same thing that you just wrote down out loud, and you will naturally have differences. So that kind of shows how our brain processes. Like the act of writing is slower than speech. So there's a little bit more of a deliberateness to writing. And the sort of in between that is typing. So particularly for anyone millennial and younger who grew up with typing, we can type just as fast as we speak. So sometimes we type and we don't even realize what we've typed. So I would really emphasize like doing the handwriting compared to speech, and you'll naturally see that you're going to phrase things differently.
Got another question in the chat. I think I already know the answer to this, but I think it'll also generate some good discussion just about conversation design in general. do you need a master's degree to be in the conversation experience design field?
No, no. As somebody who loves degrees, no. Fundamentally, your graduate degrees are going to be too narrow to be all that important for this specific field unless they are in this field. You can do a lot of the research on your own, which is very important. They are important to hirers. HR teams seem to like graduate degrees, but my master's was on the noun phrase structure of Upper Tanana and how to teach it, and my PhD was on documenting and creating a spell checker for Dene Sushine, a native Canadian language. So, no.
Mary, I saw you come up. I do want to hear, since you kind of talked a little bit more about being a designer specifically.
Yeah, well, what I can suggest is, well, of course, I have the same answer. You don't need a degree. What I would suggest is to learn to master a program, a software, like the big ones. It might be Google Dialogflow, Lewis, you know, just it's something that it's not necessary, because when you design, you are not necessarily supposed to know a software, but I've seen that it's something that is required. It's the nice to have that most companies might ask, okay, you're a designer, maybe you're a linguist, do you know how to use a software? So that's something I would suggest. And there are, well, Google Dialogflow, I think there are many free courses that you can take, and I don't know about other software actually.
Yeah, I think personally speaking, I have a user experience background. So you don't even necessarily, like, linguistics is not required, although I will say, I think from what you've heard today, it really plays an important part in a lot of this. I can tell you that there's a lot of inflections and nuance to language that I don't fully understand, because that is not my background, and it is important. But no, that doesn't mean that you can't be a part of conversational experience design. There's actually a lot of areas and roles that are part of it to make everything work. We did get a really good question about, we're getting into the science and the math, y'all. How do you all stay in touch with new research being published on linguistics? And I think we got another question that's kind of a bit of a follow-up of, you know, how much of a role does statistical analysis play in some of this? And I'll kind of open it up, whoever feels like answering first.
I love talking, so I will jump in. So I actually put out an alert on Google, so it would update me when there was new scholarly articles posted about anything with linguistics and conversation design. There's a lot of stuff that does come out, so I do think it's worth staying in touch with that, right? As well as JSTOR, who I love. They all have articles that come out fairly regularly. Also, academia.edu, despite the fact that it constantly will plug the same stuff, it is a good place to get new research articles. Companies directly also produce articles. For instance, I'm a big supporter of Wobot. If any of you work there, I very much love what you're doing, and your white papers are fabulous. But find a company like that. They'll put out white papers, which you can then follow and keep up with. I would also maybe pay attention to anything new in NLU, NLP, NLG. So natural language processing, understanding, and generation, because then you'll be able to see different systems and how they are performing and what is being put out there. Research is happening all the time. And as for statistical research or statistical analysis, you may find that there's a period after you release a bot where you have to then analyze it to make sure that the intents make sense and that you understand what the users are doing. So you can make changes. Ultimately, that's going to be very useful as a conversation designer, so that you can sort everything quickly, see where you're having failures, where those failures are. But I think just in general, having that statistical background is going to be good just entering the field. But afterwards, I don't necessarily think it's needed so much as an additional benefit. I know R, it's great. It helped me get my QA job. I've never used it in conversation design.
I would recommend Linguist Twitter, which is just like hashtag Linguist Twitter. There's a ton of lists that you can follow. if you are a linguist and you want to stay up on research that way, I wouldn't recommend that if you don't have a linguistics degree, because I love linguist Twitter. I'm on there every day. I don't follow any celebrities. It's just linguists. And sometimes it makes me feel dumb, and that's okay, right? So that is, I think, the best way to stay on top of research if you are like me. And I didn't leave academia because I don't love academia. I do, but it's kind of collapsed in on itself. So it's a good way to stay in touch and then still work in your industry job. And then in terms of statistics, I think you can learn these skills in like lots of other jobs as well. So if you've done any sort of marketing, a lot of times you'll do like data analysis. So don't think that you have to learn like hard-coded stats. Like you can kind of learn stats on the job, depending on what programs you use. There's a lot more information now about how to make stats accessible. So you don't necessarily need to have grad level stats to be able to do stats in a daily capacity.
I 100% agree. And also, I was brought up in the chat, and I think this is really important. The soft skills are incredibly important, more so for conversation designers than some of the hard skills. Those things can be learned. Every company will want you to do something a little bit different, but the soft skills are going to be what pushes you over the edge. It's going to be the thing that makes you amazing and desirable as an employee.
I think another question that's really interesting. I know Alyssa has touched on this a little bit, but Mary and Faylene, I'd really like you to weigh in as well. So this individual said, I'm really interested in semantic pejoration of terms for women and problematic gender norms in language. Do you think that conversation design is making a difference in steering people towards more inclusive language?
I think I'm just going to quickly jump in. This is really, really interesting. And I think that it depends on who is writing, because you can perpetuate a stereotype that you don't even know that you have because you don't know that you have it. But I think that in general, we perpetuate stereotypes because that's what we feel comfortable with. And it's really good on your team to make sure that there's at least one voice that says, hey, no. For instance, my previous company, we had someone who wanted to put sweetie at the end of everything that the voice bot said. Not everything, but a lot of things, because like sweetie, it's an older woman, it's a woman talking to someone, sweetie. But everything was written by a man. It sounded like it was written by a man. Sweetie sounded a little bit and so you needed somebody to sit down and be like, okay, we are leading the conversation here. If we're leading the conversation, we can't lead it into the swamp, please. So that's my 2 cents. But Mary, you were also going to go.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I think, well, I see that if there is a place where a change can happen, it's really in the conversational AI space. I'm really optimistic because yes, stereotypes perpetrate, but I see that there's more awareness in the conversational design space. So I'm really optimistic.
And that being said as well, NLG, the generation that we've seen, especially with recently with what Meta produced, if you rely on bad data, you will get bad results. If you rely on people putting in things that are a little bit not great, you'll get bad results. So it's about cleaning the data, making sure whatever goes in stays good, and then you have someone who goes through the gold standard of that.
I think it's also making sure you don't come across like you're on a soapbox. And this is like one of my pet topics and I'm really passionate about it, but I've kind of had to modulate the way that I talk about it so people respond to it, because a lot of times the people that need to hear information about gendered language use are not receptive to it. Their hackles go up immediately. So I think what's important is when you're presented with those opportunities is doing it almost in a subtle way. So you make suggestions, but maybe not as overt as if you have an audience that is more interested in the whys and hows. So I think you can be kind of sneaky about it because you're making the overall experience better.
Yeah, thank you. So this could probably be its own talk, quite frankly, with how deep it is and how much it can expand. But we are coming to a close of our event. So I think someone had something really quick. So maybe we could do a quick hit from each of the panelists before I let you all go about your day. So what is one thing you would like conversation designers to stop doing? And as a designer, I will pay very close attention to. Or maybe keep doing. We can do it that way as well.
I'm going to do a stop first. Stop doing. When you decide to explain dialogue, please don't just use a thesaurus. It's are you feeling pain is not the same as are you navigating pain or are you sensing any pain. Those are different things. Please don't use a thesaurus. Make a fully new sentence.
Mary, is there something you would like fellow conversation designers to stop doing?
Something to stop doing. That's a tough one. Maybe just to think in terms of flow, conversational flows, because sometimes it's more complex than just, yes, no. So to be more open to work with other tools and in other ways.
I think overall awareness of who is on your team and where they're located. So say I find this is more of a problem with American-based companies where everyone on the team is American and they write very American. So even if you're the only conversation designer and no one else on your team does conversation design, but they're from another location, you should ask their opinion about how do you say this? What word do you use for that? And take that feedback in, because the way that you speak is not representative of all the varieties of English or any other language that you're working in.
All really great lessons. I would add one more thing, and I would say I see this more with chat, but don't start in the visuals of the chat. So conversation design, the interface is language. So start with the words first. Don't jump into anything visual before you get going. And I think we're at time. So thank you so much for our panelists. This was fascinating. I would like 5 more sessions, please, because I really would like to expand on some of these conversations you all had. Thank you everyone for attending. We've got a ton of links in the chat. If you did not click or write all of them down, don't worry. A recorded version of this session will be published to our YouTube, so you can go back and check everything out. Please take advantage of that 25% off code for the Conversation Design Institute. It's totally worth it, and everybody loves a discount, so why not? So thank you all. Have a wonderful morning, evening, afternoon, depending where you're from. And we're looking forward to seeing you again at our next event next month. So bye all. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. This was wonderful.
Bye.